Definitely. I want to move forward into kind of the Bronze Age, which is kind of like the '80s slasher films a little bit. And specifically in regards to I think it's fair to say that in the 1950s, 1960s, Alfred Hitchcock was the master of horror. It's arguable that today, kind of talking about what you were just literally referring to, is that if a horror film isn't making a social commentary, it's not going to do very well. In that regard, it's arguable that the master of horror today might be like a Jordan Peele.
Hmm.
But of the 80s,
There's somebody who is setting out to make social commentary.
yes,
But he used Twilight
yes,
Zone,
I
which is
agree.
all social commentary.
That's all it is, yeah. But of the 80s, I would say, or do you think it's fair to say that Wes Craven might have been the master of horror of the 80s? And maybe the 90s with Scream?
Well, you've got a couple of different things. Wes Craven did some really interesting stuff that's only starting to be respected. But I would go a little. I'd lean into John Carpenter a bit for sure.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
they Live is a just incendiary kind of torching of the '80s consumerism.
I'm here to
I
kick ass and to chew bubblegum, and I'm all out of bubblegum.
But that film is about Reaganomics and the division between wealthy and poor people that was growing and growing and growing and really has never rebounded. But really, literally, rich people as space aliens, as monsters that are quite inhuman and only use us essentially as food. Is just keep doing what you're doing. Just spend money. Just keep spending. This dollar bill is your god. So. Wes Craven did some cool stuff with Nightmare on Elm Street, and there was a huge boom in slasher films after Halloween, which is
Oh
probably
yeah,
arguably
yeah. Halloween. How do we leave that one off the map?
yeah. Well, that's John Carpenter right there. He likes to kickstart whole wings of horror and then just leave, just like run off and go do something else. Um, but then after that, of course, you've got Friday the 13th, which is huge, and you've got a number of other lesser slasher films, which kind of become their own thing at that point. They like shoot off and become their own branch of horror. To me, I'm not as interested in slasher movies
Mm.
because they're just kind of saying one thing. But in the 1980s, you have a rise in televangelism. You have Reagan as president, and you have a talk about the moral majority, right? The
Mm.
Christian majority. And for the first time, you have conversations, which is really a backlash of like the sex, drugs, and rock and roll of the 60s and 70s and disco and all of that. It's kind of a backlash to new, uptight, button-up, pearl-clutching morality. So what is Friday the 13th? You have a killer that is basically taking out anybody who violates those rules. Scream talked about this a lot. But
Yes.
you have this couple goes off and have sex and they get murdered. And this guy steals something and he gets murdered. And basically anytime anybody breaks from the norm, breaks from the moral norm, they get justifiably killed. So the teenagers you bring in there are the immoral jackasses that nobody likes.
Yeah.
And you don't for the way the killer kills them. Uh, but you have a tremendous amount of horror films in the 1980s. It really is this just massive boom, and a lot of it happens between like 1982, 83. You've got Poltergeist, and you've got The Thing from 1981. You've got American Werewolf in London from 1981. You've got Wolfen. You've got Creepshow, Poltergeist, Something Wicked This Way Comes, V on TV. You've got a return of the Twilight Zone. You've got Twilight Zone the movie.
Yep.
You've got The Day After. You've got Gremlins, you got Reanimator, The Hitcher, Bad Taste, Hellraiser, Evil Dead 2. You got
It just
so many
seems
of these
like in the
movies
'80s it
coming
was a
at you.
huge resurgence of the horror genre. Like, yeah, there were
Right.
scary movies, but like in the bigger picture, okay, yeah, I mean, I guess to the viewer, the Gremlins probably very scary at the time, but going back and rewatching it, it's not. Come on, guys, it's not scary. It's
Right.
weird. It's gruesome. It's
Mhm.
fantastical. I don't know. I did anyway. That's a whole debate for another day. But in the '80s, we do see this massive resurgence of like all things like spooky, scary, creepy, creep show. You pointed out creep show. The
I love.
Twilight Zone the movie.
Mhm.
Like all these, and it was more atmospherical, and I feel like that was, Rosemary's Baby kind of leading into things. The Omen. We lead in.
Well, that's interesting too, because that takes you back to the 1970s, where you have Rosemary, you have the Omen, you have a lot of films. When you go back, that's Jonestown again, which was 1978. So you have the familiar being unfamiliar. So in the 70s, you've got 1975, which really kickstarts the movie business, the blockbuster. You can argue that Jaws was the first blockbuster.
Yeah.
It creates the multiplex special effects boom of the 80s. But when you go back to like Rosemary's Baby and The Omen, what are those films about? They're about like, who's your child? I've given don't know, which came out of honestly thalidomide. Have you ever heard of thalidomide?
You're breaking up a little bit. It's
Okay.
the Skype connection comes and goes a little bit, so it's I think you're going to be okay.
Yeah. So you go from much more personal horror in the 60s and 70s to big, expansive space horror again. A lot of that comes out of the movies in the 1980s. Watched all the horror movies of the 1950s, which were about big technological booms.
That's true, yeah.
And the people that are making horror movies now grew up in the 60s and 70s and watched these more personal films. So that has a lot to do with it. But big things happened in the 80s too. America was going through a gigantic boom. You have all this new wealth. You've got the space shuttle. You've got all these things. And then even the disastrous things that happened weren't nasty like war. Vietnam was over. Those battles were already fought.
Yeah.
So the big things that happened, like in both 1986, you have both the Challenger explosion and you've got Chernobyl, which are like big, spectacular, cinematic disasters that happen.
Sure.
So, there's no surprise that that's reflected in what's going on. But you've also got a little more frivolous, a little less serious, a little more playful horror movies, like movies like Gremlins, where they're more fun. So, kind of cool.
I wonder, like, again, the social consciousness, what was it about, like, some of these slasher films? Because you said, like, the thing about the slasher films was that it plays to one note, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
When you break it down, it plays to one note, to one idea. And depending on what slasher film you're watching, is essentially the same thing over and over and over again. The creative, even though I can't get myself to watch the films, the Nightmare on Elm Street series, I think, is very fascinating from a psychological standpoint.
The Nightmare on Nightmare on Elm Street's its own thing.
Yeah.
That stuff is really cool. And
it's based on a true story, too.
Sorta, yeah. But what's neat about Nightmare on Elm Street, and that's a credit to the different directors that they kept throwing at the series. Was they were very creative. They like, what do you dream about? What are your dreams? And they could get super weird and super creative with kills, tongue coming out of a phone or something like that.
Welcome
and then
to prime time. And
then you've got I can't remember if it was the fourth Nightmare on Elm Street, but Dream Warriors.
Which I think that was the third one.
Third or fourth, yeah. But that one was really good too, because the first one was cool, and then the second one was a retread, and there was a bit of retreading, and then Dream Warriors kind of turned the idea on its head, where it's like, now let's go hunt Freddy Krueger. That was directed by Frank Darabont, by the way, who went on to do Green Mile, and he went on to do
So I just looked it up on IMDb. Let me bring it up on screen here.
And
Nightmare on Elm Street 3 is directed by Chuck Russell.
Chuck Russell did Dream Warriors?
That's what IMDb is saying.
Huh.
Hey everybody, thanks for watching. If you like this video, click like. If you really like this video, click subscribe. And if you really, really like this video, click share. Because that is exactly what Jaws the shark would want you to do. Dun 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 dun.